If you have been following my channel, and even if you haven't, I'm going to tell you, we have been talking here about the people around Andy Warhol who made his Silver Factory, the studio where he produced his work in the 1960s. We've been talking about the people who made the factory what it was, and we have covered some very important figures in this world. We talked about Billy Name, we talked about Lou Reed, we talked about Edie Sedgwick, we've talked about Valerie Solanas, we've talked about some big players, but I'm gonna go out on a limb, and I think that this is controversial, but I think the person we're talking about today, Gerard Malanga, is potentially the most important person in the Andy Warhol story, at least in the early days, getting him to be the famous artist that he became. But before we get into all that, hi, I am Kate Name, and I am the creator, producer, writer of a show called The Factory, which is an immersive show that is based in Andy Warhol's art studio. And the show is really fun. It's an immersive experience. So basically the idea is that you, as the audience, are invited to a party at the factory where you can sit for your own screen test, you can help silk screen paintings, you can help produce an underground movie, star in an underground movie, you can rock out with the bands, you can follow Valerie Solanas, see why she shot Andy Warhol, maybe go to a scum meeting, and you can even follow Andy and try and get in with Andy and try and become his next superstar. So it's very choose your own adventure, and essentially you're just there making original art with the cast as the story of Andy Warhol unfolds around you. So it's super, super fun. I have kind of exciting news as well. I have started a Patreon. So if you want to support my journey to getting this show into the real world, you can join the Patreon, and that honestly is the best way to support. Every cent raised through the Patreon will go directly towards producing this show, and you can get some fun behind the scenes videos. You'll get early access to these YouTube videos. You'll also be the first to know when tickets go on sale to the factory, and you also get access to some VIP live events that will be invite only. So join the Patreon if you want to support my journey. I'm an independent producer, so literally it's just me out here. I live in Brooklyn, I work at a bar, and I'm trying to make this show happen. So it's been a really long journey for me to get there, but things are ramping up and I am planning a production in 2025. So all that being said, let's jump in to the story of Gerard Malanga. So before we get started, I have to say, Gerard is still alive. He is one of the very few people in this whole factory story that survived the factory. I mean, like, truly, many of the people did not make it out of like the late 60s, early 70s alive. So it's truly incredible that Gerard is still with us. And I have to say, I have seen Gerard in person. I, like, 2021 maybe, went to a poetry reading that Gerard did in Soho at this like Italian art museum. I think it was something Italian. And I am so embarrassed still to talk about this. I wore this beautiful red dress, and I was like so nervous to see Gerard because, you guys, I had been working on this show since I had the idea in 2015, and it's been a crazy journey researching, writing, developing this show. I had like, maybe someday I'll make some more videos about like the behind the scenes aspect of like how I wrote this show and why I wrote this show, but it has been really crazy. And so I was like terrified to meet a person who I had written a show about, you know, like he's a character in the show, and that's weird. Like that's a weird thing. Like, can you imagine a stranger coming up to you and being like, hi, I wrote a play about you? Like, that's weirdo behavior on my part. So I went to this reading, and he was so nice, and it was so low key. I mean, like, he's an 80-year-old man, you know, like he's not a celebrity really in the way that we think of a celebrity, but he's a celebrity to me. I was fangirling so hard, so much so that there's basically like he did a reading and then we were gonna take a little break and then we were gonna walk to this like courtyard and view a film that he was in. And he was like, I literally could have just talked to him and it would have been fine, but I couldn't. I don't know if you're Community fans out there, if you've seen the episode of Community where Troy meets LeVar Burton.
Hey, Troy. Hi, I'm LeVar Burton.
I told Pierce 1,000 times I never wanted to meet LeVar in person. I just wanted a picture. You can't disappoint a picture. I hate you, Pierce. I hate you so much.
That was me. I literally went to the reading, couldn't handle myself, and during the break when we were gonna go move to a new location to see this film, I left and I went home and I cried because I could not bring myself to talk to Gerard, an 80-year-old man. I just love him. So again, weirdo behavior on my part, but he means a lot to me. And I was, you know, like Troy said, you can't disappoint a picture. Like, I was like, what if he hates the show? What if he hates that I wrote it? What if he... So, I'm sure that's not true. Maybe he'll see this and maybe we'll meet. I actually... Whatever. Okay. Let's start talking about Gerard. One more thing. Before we get into Gerard today, I do want to say that most of the information that I have about Gerard and about a lot of the other people in my show comes from this book. It's called Factory Made and it's by Stephen Watson. While we're telling stories, I've actually been to this man's house. I am the weirdo. I really am. Back in earlier, when maybe like 2018, when I was still like kind of an earlier development of the show, I was reading this book and I realized through internet research that Stephen Watson, the author of this book, lived in my neighborhood. And I live in New York, so like, it's kind of one of the beautiful things about living in New York City is that so many cool people live in New York City. And so I reached out to Stephen Watson and he very kindly invited me to his apartment, and similar, less stressful than my Gerard moment, but still kind of fangirled and didn't know what to say and was just like, I can't believe I'm here. This old man's house. But he was so, so nice. And he actually gave me some unpublished interviews that he had done with Gerard. So I do have like the transcripts of those interviews and I used them. It was influential in the writing process for me writing the show. So super, super cool that I was able to have access to like unpublished interviews with Gerard. So I just want to say that Stephen Watson is really cool and Gerard's really cool and they're really cool guys and I love them. And yeah, so, but I bring that up to, one, give credit to Stephen Watson and the research that he's done, and also to say that if you're interested in learning more about this story beyond what I'm doing in these YouTube videos, this is the book. So, okay, now let's get into it. So, Gerard Malanga was born in the Bronx in 1943, and he was the only child to 2 Italian immigrants who adored him. He was such a loved child. Notably different than a lot of the other people we have talked about so far, and probably one of the reasons he is still alive. Gerard was super cute as a young boy, still cute as an old man, and he didn't do amazing in school. He went to a Catholic school, and the nuns thought that he was kind of a chatterbox, unfocused. He actually failed his 10th grade English class, which is really funny because, as you'll see, he is quite the poet. So he does okay, and he loves dancing, and he would race home from school every day in order to catch American Bandstand that came on after school, and he would learn all the dances that were on American Bandstand, and then he would run back to school the next day, and him and his friends would practice doing like the Lindy and the Mambo and the Cha-Cha in the school during lunch at like in the cafeteria. So he's a very good natural dancer, and he's super charismatic, and he's very handsome. So in 1959, when he's a high school senior, Gerard is introduced to poetry through his English teacher named Daisy Alden, and he is in love with his teacher, and he's also entranced by the art form of poetry. And Gerard becomes consumed with reading and writing poetry and learning everything he can about it. And Daisy, who is kind of like connected in the New York literary world, starts introducing Gerard to some of her friends who are like luminaries in the New York poetry scene. Then he graduates high school and he's still just really obsessed with poetry, but he feels like Daisy Alden's friends are much older than him and he wants to connect with people that are closer to his own age. So he starts going to all these poetry readings and kind of hanging out in like this downtown avant-garde art scene. Gerard actually first saw Andy Warhol at a party for this woman named Marie Menken, who was kind of this like socialite and experimental filmmaker. And her and another kind of downtown luminary type, Willard Mass, threw this party together. And Gerard's at this party, and the first time he claps eyes on Andy Warhol, Marie Menken is chasing this pale man around a table trying to kiss him while Andy, the pale man, is going, ew, ew, and trying to like get away from this woman. That is the first time that Gerard ever sees Andy Warhol, and he's not interested. He really is more focused on trying to meet other poets. So Andy Warhol was not that exciting to him at his first meeting. But later, Gerard is introduced to Andy more formally at a poetry reading that Frank O'Hara was throwing. Gerard at this point is remarkably well known in the downtown poetry community, especially given his age. He's only 20 years old. So for only being 20, it's kind of surprising that he has all these like well-connected friends, and it's mostly because of his teacher, Daisy Alden. And they start talking, Andy and Gerard, and what really grabs Andy's attention is that Gerard knows how to silkscreen. Gerard had an internship when he was in high school that his teacher, Daisy Alden, had arranged for him. It was with one of her former students, and the internship was at this artist studio, and Gerard learned how to silkscreen. And Andy has just started doing this silkscreen paintings. At the time, Andy Warhol was not the artist that we know today. He was working as an illustrator. He illustrated for magazines like Glamour Magazine, Cosmopolitan, those type of magazines. And he also worked as a window dresser, where in these big downtown department stores, he would set up the scenes that would be in the windows. So he was working as a creative person, and he was making a living as a creative person, but he was not considered like an artist with a capital A. You know what I mean? Like, he was not a fine artist. So, and he really wanted to be. He really, really wanted to be. So he had started doing these paintings, these silkscreen paintings, and they were getting a little bit of attention, but he wasn't really considered to be an artist like that yet. But he has a lot of ambition. And when he hears that Gerard knows how to silkscreen, he hires him on the spot to be his assistant. And Andy at the time was working out of this abandoned firehouse. This was before the factory was even a thing. So Andy hires Gerard, and Gerard starts working with Andy at this firehouse. And it's just the two of them every day, and they're working on, at the time, Andy Warhol was working on his death and disaster paintings. So that was what they spent the summer primarily doing, was these death and disaster images of like car crashes and suicides, and like exactly what it sounds, death and disaster. They also at this time were doing the early silkscreen paintings. So they worked on the Elizabeth Taylor paintings and the Elvis paintings at the firehouse. And Gerard observes that Andy has like a very zen-like attitude when it comes to making these silkscreen paintings. And if ever the paintings were like off-center, or if they had any mistakes, Andy would just say, it's part of the art. He didn't really care. And Gerard said that, quote, I think it can be boiled down to one statement: embracing your mistakes. That was Andy's kind of whole attitude about making art. And so they continue making these paintings, and in the summer of 1963, Andy and Gerard go to Peerless Camera, which was marketed as the world's largest camera store on Lexington Avenue across the street from Grand Central Terminal. And Gerard knows that his friend, Marie Menken, the woman who was chasing Andy around trying to kiss him, she's an experimental filmmaker, and Gerard knows that Marie uses a 16mm Bolex camera. And so he tells Andy, like, hey, Marie uses this camera, you should use it too. And the reason that Gerard suggests it is because it's very like user friendly, essentially. It's just push the button, turn it on, and that's it. And Gerard knows that Andy is not like a technical person, especially when it comes to filmmaking. And he really wanted it to be just easy, push the button and roll. So Andy, at Gerard's suggestion, buys this Bolex camera and he starts making really, really short films, like 3-minute or less films. And they're mostly of like his friends. It'll be his friend like cooking dinner, or Freddie Herco dancing on the roof, or not that roof, but you watched my Freddie Herco video, you know that ends in disaster. But yeah, go watch that video, it's interesting. Anyways, so he's making these small videos and they're kind of like Valentines to his friends. And he sometimes will like take stills from these photos and make prints of them and give them as gifts to his friends. So it's pretty like low key at this point. And around the same time, this is summer 1963, Gerard falls in with this group known as the Mole People. And I have touched on the Mole People in a number of videos, but basically they were this fearsomely intelligent, really drugged out group of essentially homeless people and criminals, all with kind of like artistic flair. They had a unifying love of opera, and they all also loved amphetamines. So that was kind of the two things that brought the Mole People together, but they were like really like smart, witty, artistic type of people. And they were all like varying degrees of homeless, but they would convene every night for parties, and the parties would float around New York City depending on where they could find room to party, because they're all homeless. So Billy Name is one of these people. Dorothy Podber was one of these people. There's some more people that we will cover in upcoming videos who are part of this circle, but Gerard starts to hang out with the Mole People. So in July of 1963, Andy goes with Gerard to a Frank O'Hara poetry reading in like these, you know, downtown circles that Gerard was running in with all these like very fancy poets. And Gerard introduces Andy to Ted Berrigan, who is the publisher and curator, editor of this magazine called C, which was an underground like poetry magazine. So Ted tells Andy that the upcoming issue of C magazine is going to feature a poem by Gerard. And Andy's like, oh, I would love to do the cover. So they agree that Andy will design the cover for the upcoming issue of C magazine. Now, Andy is a sneaky little bitch. And this is, he really feels like the Frank O'Hara like art people do not consider him an artist. In fact, they were flat out rude to him. Like, Frank O'Hara in particular made it really hard for Andy. Gerard says Frank just kept the keys to the door. He wasn't going to let Andy in. And their mutual friend John Giorno would say that Frank O'Hara used to laugh at Andy. He would make fun of him to his face and just torture him. And so Andy even tried to like get Frank to be on his good side. He gave Frank O'Hara a Marilyn Monroe print, which now is worth millions and millions of dollars, but Frank just shoves it in a closet. He doesn't care. He does not like Andy. And so there's kind of this divide between like the cool, respected artists of the day and Andy Warhol. So Andy decides to use this cover of C magazine as an opportunity. And so he decides he wants Gerard on the cover, and he also invites this man named Edwin Denby, who was an older poet who was very well respected in this community. And so they go to Edward Denby's apartment, and Andy shoots a series of Polaroid portraits. And at first it's just Edwin seated in this like straight back chair, and Gerard's like standing behind him with his hand on his shoulder. And so they're taking very like, you know, professional type portraits. And Gerard thinks that the vibe is kind of like this torch passing moment of like Edwin's generation of poets passing the torch on to Gerard's younger generation of poets. And then at the end of the shoot, Andy suggests that Gerard lean down and kiss Edwin on the mouth. And that photo is the photo that he uses on the cover of C magazine. And this starts quite a scandal, because the reality was that everybody pretty much in this downtown poetry scene was gay. Like Frank O'Hara was gay, Edwin was gay, like everyone was queer to some degree, which now now we know like that kind of goes hand in hand with being an artist, but at the time it was not talked about. Like homosexuality was like really kept on the down low. It was known, but it was not discussed openly at all. And so Andy putting this picture of two men kissing on the front of a magazine brings this conversation that like has stayed very private into the open. And it's basically dubbed kind of like a visual rumor or like a visual gossip. And so he kind of like exposed this private knowledge of this like super elite group and just like put it out into public. And a visual rumor, sorry, that's what they called it. And Gerard interprets this cover as kind of like Andy's revenge on this like very exclusive hoity-toity poetry group. Now, they're still at the firehouse. November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Gerard and Andy hear this news announced when they're walking through Grand Central Station, and they immediately run back to the firehouse and they silkscreen this painting called Kiss, which is used a still from the film Dracula, and it's kind of this commentary on death. And so they're doing all this work, and this same period, late 1963, is when Billy Name starts divinely inspired and like just fueled by meth. He covers his whole apartment in tinfoil. I've talked about this story in the past, but if you haven't seen my other videos, Billy Name was this lighting designer and kind of jack of all trades. He also knew how to cut hair, one of his many skills, and he was throwing these hair cutting parties at his apartment, and he had covered his whole apartment in tinfoil, the way that meth heads do that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, we all like put like such great importance on Billy covering his apartment in meth, but really, or covering his apartment in tinfoil, but it's really crackhead behavior, like if you really think about it. But it was beautiful. And Andy Warhol goes to one of these parties where basically they would go on for days at a time. Everyone's doing meth and Billy's just like cutting everybody's hair like a maniac. And Andy goes to one of these parties and sees the shimmering scene of like very cool hot people getting their hair cut in this silver spacey apartment, and he's like amazed by it, and he's like, this has to be a film, because he's making films now. And he had just signed the lease at this new industrial hat factory in Midtown Manhattan, and he asked Billy to come and do this whole silver thing at this new space. So Billy moves into the bathroom at the factory, what would become the factory, this new studio, and starts rewiring the electricity and making it safer for them to work in, and Gerard and Andy move all the painting equipment in. So now it's a trio, Billy, Andy, and Gerard. So now things really start rocking and rolling at the factory. The mole people, who I mentioned earlier, who were constantly having to move their parties around because they were all homeless, they finally have a place where they can all hang out. And Andy loves having people around. It makes him feel like he's kind of a weird, quiet guy, but he likes other people being around to kind of provide the entertainment. So Gerard and Andy are just silk screening all day, every day. And then Billy's friends start hanging out and they listen to opera while they're silk screening. And Andy starts filming a series called Screen Tests, where basically the idea is it's kind of this initiation point of a project he had started called Superstars. And he started basically turning the mole people into stars. And he did that by having them sit in front of a camera and just taking these moving portraits of everyone that was hanging out at the factory. And sometimes people would take on new names. Billy Name is one of those people. His name was originally Billy Linick. When he became a superstar, he changed it to Billy Name because that is, you know, a star has to have a star's name. So they're doing these like small portraits, doing kind of like these experimental films, and they're making the paintings. The paintings continuously are made the whole time the factory is running. And so things are really, like I said, rocking and rolling. Edie Sedgwick starts hanging out at the factory. She's the new superstar. And they're just, you know, it's just a constant, literally a factory churning out films and paintings. That is what the factory does. That is the product it produces. And so things are going really well. And they're making all these movies, and Gerard is kind of always like relegated to the sidelines when they do these films because he's Andy's assistant. He's there to paint. And he's the only person at the factory in the whole factory story that ever got paid for his work at the factory. He made minimum wage, but that was more than literally anybody else ever got. So Gerard has an actual job to do. So even though they're like making these stars, and the thing is, the stars that Andy's making are actually becoming famous in the real world. And the more that happens, the more new people start showing up at the factory because word starts to spread around New York City that if you just show up at this studio in Midtown, whose doors are always open 24 hours a day, you can just hang out and this Andy Warhol guy might put you in one of his movies and you might become famous for real. So as this happens, the like behavior at the factory starts heightening because people are trying to get Andy's attention so that he will notice them and put them in his movies. And so Andy also never really gives anything. Like he is so withdrawn and so like, oh, wow, oh, like even when people do something outrageous, he doesn't say anything. He just goes, oh, interesting. So then they do something crazier and crazier and crazier, trying and trying and trying to get Andy's attention. So the behavior and the vibe of the factory is like continually getting crazier and crazier. No one's ever asleep. Everyone's on meth. So that's the energy. So in spring 1965, this guy, Ronald Tavel, who is a screenwriter, aspiring screenwriter. He writes this script called Vinyl, which is based on A Clockwork Orange. And this is really new territory for the factory because prior to this, the movies that they were making was just Andy turning the 16mm Bolex camera on and seeing what happened. Like, there was never any script. There was often not even sound for these films. They're just like silent films of very basic things. Like sleep is a man sleeping. Like that's the film. So they really didn't have a lot of plot and they didn't have scripts. So Vinyl is really new territory because there's a script and they're gonna attempt to kind of have a plot and like kind of make it a real film in a sense. And so Andy feels like he kind of owes it to Gerard because Gerard has been with him since the very beginning and now the factory's like blowing up and there's so many people like vying for Warhol's attention. He feels like he owes Gerard like a star turn. So he tells Gerard that he is going to be the star of Vinyl. Gerard is thrilled. Except Andy, I don't know what's wrong with him. Truly, like, that's a question I've been trying to answer for years. But after telling Gerard that he can like be the star of this film, he starts to send Gerard on all these errands. And so they're trying to have rehearsals and like they'll start the rehearsal and then Andy will be like, oh, Gerard, I need you to go and run this errand and send Gerard away. So Gerard is trying his best to like learn his lines and like get ready to film Vinyl. And Andy is sabotaging him basically. And so Gerard is getting really frustrated because he thinks that Andy's doing him a favor and putting him in the film, but he's setting him up for failure. So Gerard's trying to learn the lines. And at this time is also when Edie Sedgwick has shown up and is like the new girl in town at the factory. And Andy tells Edie that she can be in Vinyl too. Gerard is really upset because he's like, I thought I was gonna be the star of Vinyl. And Andy's like, oh, no, don't worry about it. We're just gonna put Edie on this trunk. She's gonna sit behind you. She'll smoke a cigarette. She won't have any lines. Like, you're still the star of the show. So they film Vinyl and Edie's the breakout star. Like, she is just so beautiful, gorgeous, sitting there smoking her cigarette. And everyone's like, who is this girl? And so even though Gerard is the star, he doesn't really get any attention. Now, I haven't mentioned Mary Woronov yet in any of these videos, and I have a video about her coming out next week, but we can't talk about Gerard without talking about Mary. So Mary Woronov in 1965 was a student at Cornell University, and at the time, she was experimenting with something she called gender slipping. Mary is like statuesque, very beautiful girl, but kind of intimidating, and she starts dressing like the macho guys that she is lusting after. And she also starts dancing at this tiny stage at a local bar wearing black jeans and ripped t-shirts. And she says, quote, "It was better to dance in front of them than to dance with one stupid guy. Why have just one when you could have 20? So in the fall of 1965, Gerard and Mary meet at a bus stop in Ithaca, New York, and Mary notices that Gerard kind of flaunts this performative queer femininity in the same performative way that she flaunts masculinity. They're both like actually kind of on the straighter end of the sexuality spectrum, but they're doing like this opposite thing of like pretending to be the opposite gender, but actually they're very attracted to each other, and so they're drawn to each other immediately. Now, Gerard goes back to the factory after meeting Mary, just kind of a chance meeting, and then later, Mary, as part of her college coursework through Cornell University, they tour Andy Warhol's studio, like this group of students. And so as she's touring the factory with her class, Gerard notices her and is like, oh my God, that's the girl I saw at the bus stop. And he's like, Mary, come take a screen test. And so he steals Mary away from her class and they do a screen test, and she never goes back to school. And she starts hanging out at the factory. At the same time that Mary starts hanging out at the factory, the Velvet Underground also starts rehearsing at the factory. The Velvet Underground, unsigned band at this point, and they start to use the factory as just like their rehearsal space because everyone is hanging out there. And they kind of become like the house band, and Andy decides that he is going to manage the Velvet Underground. And they make very aggressive music that is hard to listen to, especially for 1960s ears. And they have a very aggressive look and aggressive sound. And Andy's like, I'm gonna manage you, I'm gonna be your producer, but you need to have a beauty with you to counteract all of this ugliness that you are doing. That is literally how he phrases it. And he insists that they use the model Nico as kind of like the band's chanteuse. And Lou Reed is not about this. He is like, no, we are the Velvet Underground. We don't need anybody else. And he's like, no, I insist. You need somebody beautiful because everyone else is too ugly. So they come to an agreement and they decide that they will be billed as the Velvet Underground and Nico. So if you've ever seen the debut album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, that is why it is titled that, is because Lou Reed was like, she's not in the band. And Andy was like, she is in the band. And they were like, okay, we're the band, she's Nico, we're separate things. So January 10th, 1966, the Velvet Underground and Nico make their debut at this psychiatrist banquet in New York City, the New York Society for Clinical Psychology. And Warhol is invited to the banquet to like give a presentation, and his presentation is the Velvet Underground playing, Nico singing in like this very droning German accent, and Gerard has a whip and he's doing like the visuals where he just like does this crazy dance with a whip, and it goes badly. The psychiatrists do not know what the F is going on and they don't like it, and Andy kind of like demurs from taking responsibility for the poor reception, and he says, oh, I have an earache so I can't really hear or see. That's what he said. But even though it's kind of a failure, Warhol is like, this is so cool, I love this, and he decides that they're gonna hit the road and go on a tour. And so with Billy Name, the Velvet Underground, Nico, and Gerard and Mary now are this duo of dancers, and they do like S&M inspired whip dances. They go on the road and they go to like middle America, like Ohio, and do this whole presentation. And they're run out of town on multiple occasions by the police because people do not like this. They think it's scary. It's bad. They just are like, oh my God, what is happening? And so they're interviewed after they're run out of town by the police. In one occasion, they're interviewed for a newspaper, and Andy says, if they can take it for 10 minutes, we play it for 15. That's our motto, always leave them wanting less, which I think is hilarious. So they come back to New York City, and like, despite all of this, Andy's like, we're gonna do this. The Velvet Underground is a cool band. And they decide to do a big show in New York City at the Dom, which was a Polish like community center, kind of in St. Mark's area. And they booked the Dom, and that afternoon, Billy, Andy, Gerard, and Paul Morrissey, who was a director that started hanging out at the factory, they bring 5 projectors and 5 carousels of multicolored slides and 5 Warhol films: Vinyl, Eat, Sleep, Kiss, and Harlot. And they set up these projections all over, and Gerard paints the walls of the Dom, that they were formerly black, he paints them white so that they can project the films like all over the room. And they do this big like multimedia explosion. Billy does the lights, they project all the films, Gerard and Mary are doing their whip dance. Bridget Berlin and Ondine, two people I will be making videos of shortly, they go through the crowd during the party and they inject unsuspecting people with amphetamines. So they're just drugging the audience. And this actually is literally like the first time that a rock band had a light show at a concert, which is now something that like all rock bands do. But literally this event, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, was the first time that rock and roll and light shows happened together. So Andy's thrilled by the success of the show at the Dom, which actually did do well. The New York audience kind of understood what they were going for, that like the Velvet Underground was considered kind of cool. And so Andy's like, okay, we're gonna go to LA. And he books a 4-day trip to LA. And Nico, the Velvet Underground, Billy, Andy, Gerard, and Mary all go to LA. And before they leave, Mary's stepdad comes to the factory. Now, Mary was very, very young, like 19, I think. And her stepdad just wants assurance that Mary's gonna be looked after on this trip. And Andy hides in the bathroom. He does not want to talk to anybody's parent at all. So Gerard steps up and Gerard talks to Mary's stepdad and he says that he will protect Mary and look out for her. So they all go to LA and it once again is a disaster. They are not loved by the LA people. Their opening night show, Sonny and Cher are there. And they're like, what is this? They hate it. The last show, they do like this big concert with Frank Zappa and Jefferson Airplane and Mothers of Invention. And Frank Zappa gets on the microphone and is like, the Velvet Underground sucks. Like they are not run out of town like they are in Ohio, but like no one likes them. And then to add insult to injury, the last night they're there, they all go to a bar after the show and Gerard is arrested for carrying a concealed weapon because he has his whip for his whip dances. So they all go back to New York like kind of defeated. Now, at the same time, somebody named Valerie Solanas has been seeing these Exploding Plastic Inevitable posters around the city. And Valerie had written this play called Up Your Ass. And she thinks that if maybe this Andy Warhol guy that she's seeing on these posters looks like he produces things, maybe if he produces her play, she'll become famous and hit the big time. And so Valerie comes to the factory and Andy reads the play. And at first he's like, oh yeah, like he likes the title, Up Your Ass, like very provocative. And so Andy was like, oh sure, Valerie, I'll produce your play. And then he reads the play and he's like, oh no, like this is not good. And he also, it's very offensive and very like lewd and extreme. And Andy thinks that Valerie is actually a cop trying to entrap him. Like that the play is so bad that he's like, nobody could have actually seriously written this, right? So he thinks that Valerie's a cop trying to entrap him and like declines to produce the play. But he also loses the play. And Valerie, not a cop, insane person. And she also had written this manifesto called SCUM, which stands for the Society for Cutting Up Men. And she also was the only member of the Society for Cutting Up Men. And she becomes convinced. Now, Valerie, very smart woman. You can watch my video on Valerie. She is a very interesting person, but she, very intelligent, very, very insane. And she gets it in her head that Andy is trying to steal her work and that he stole the play on purpose and that he's conspiring against her and is gonna like use her work to become famous and like make himself a bigger artist. So she, well, first she starts sending like threatening letters to the factory, and then eventually she comes to the factory and she shoots Andy. Andy survives this, and but it really ends this era of like anything goes at the factory. And after the shooting, like everything changes. The Silver Factory era is basically from the moment that Andy starts working with Gerard until he gets shot. And everything, Andy changes as a person, as you would if you've been somebody tried to kill you. But the bummer is for Gerard is that after Andy recovers from the shooting, he's no longer strong enough to silkscreen. And so Andy stops silkscreening paintings at this point. I mean, he does later on in his career do more paintings, but he kind of stops for a while and he starts his new project, Interview Magazine, and he lets Gerard go. So Gerard is no longer part of the factory. So I have to leave it there because I literally have to run to work. I'm a working girl, guys. So I'm gonna leave it there. Like I said, Gerard is still alive. If anybody knows him out there and sends him this video, oh my God, I would love that. I'm gonna try and connect with him at some point because he's still alive. Like I said, if I can gather myself together and not be an absolute weirdo, I will try and connect with him. But I gotta go. So thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, I really thank you. If you've been watching these videos and you find them interesting, I'm so happy. I think that's so cool. And I have a lot more content on the way. So subscribe if you want to see more of this content. Like the video, it helps so much. Join the Patreon if you want to help really support the show and get it to be a real thing and not just something that's in my brain. And I'll see you next week. We're gonna talk about Mary Woronov. So thank you again for watching and I'll see you then.